Hey folks, David Stewart here. Why I prefer subbed versus dubbed anime. That is, why do I prefer to read subtitles versus listen to English voices when I'm watching an anime? Specifically, I'm talking about animation that comes from, say, Japan, foreign animation. I mentioned this in passing on a recent podcast that I recorded with Geekdom 101, if you're familiar with his YouTube channel, where I said, I really do prefer subs. And I wanted to make a video just explaining that, my reasoning, and maybe that reasoning will be compelling for you. Before I get into it, let me just say that considering subtitles versus dubs seems to be a little bit of a different thing when you're looking at live action. When you see somebody's lips moving and the words don't quite line up, like hopefully the video's in sync on this video, it can be a little bit off-putting. So a lot of people like to watch subtitles for that simply because the dub is disruptive. But the same people might really like listening to dubbed anime because the subtle movements of the animated lips are not as annoying. So that's a different kind of thing. Animation doesn't have that problem with lining up lip syncs. It's just not as noticeable. That's not really my complaint at all. Really, it has to do with the way that translation occurs when you are subtitling versus overdubbing the audio. So you can test this for yourself. And in fact, this is a great way to see my point in action. Go to a Netflix show, a Netflix anime that's from Japan, put on English audio and put on English subtitles, and you will notice that they don't match up. And they don't match up because they're different translations. And the translation which is more accurate, in my opinion, is the subtitled translation, because the subtitled translation is just a closer to just exact translation of what they were saying in Japanese. It's a direct cross translation, no paraphrasement. Whereas the dubbed audio track really tends to be paraphrased, and in some cases paraphrased in ways that I find annoying. So especially if you're watching, say, like a Funimation dub, one of the things that happens is not only do they translate it into English, but they attempt to translate it into an American dialect of English and make it idiomatic to an American audience. And if you're from the UK or the Australia or New Zealand, any country that speaks English that's not the United States or Canada, you pick up on this stuff right away, even in Canada, because, say, southeastern United States has a very particular way of talking compared to everyone in Canada. So you pick up on right away that this is not a localization, which is... It's a localization. It's not a translation into English for all English speakers. It's a localization that's targeted towards Americans. So when they do that and they add in some idiomatic language, this layer of trying to interpret what's there and make it idiomatically feeling okay for American English speakers does distort the meaning of the words. And you can just test this out for yourself by doing what I said. And it also tends to be, to me, a little bit annoying. I know whenever I'm watching this that a Japanese writer, whoever was working on the show, was not writing things like, "You ain't gonna do that." That's a Southeast United States kind of thing, to say something like that. So they weren't writing that because they're not familiar with the way that Southeast United States Americans speak. They're not sitting there analyzing American speech and trying to turn that into some sort of Japanese thing. What they probably have is something that has maybe an idiomatic element in Japanese and trying to translate that into an American localization. It just doesn't really happen. So it's better to go with the exact translation. And anime is really not the only form that does this. I've talked about how novel translations from Japanese novels will frequently add that layer of idiomatic translation to try to make it feel like the mood that existed in Japanese, and it usually doesn't quite come off right. I think it's better to just do the literal translation because then you have the true meaning of the words. And if you do this little experiment where you're watching it in English and reading the subtitles, you see that many times the meaning that they give to the dubbed version is subtly different than the one that they give to the subtitled version. Paraphrasement does change meaning. That's why I don't really like paraphrased versions of the Bible, like, say, the Living Translation or something like that. We are imposing upon it a layer of meaning that we want the words to have. The shades of meaning do exist. That's why the English language has so many different words. Is rouge means something different than red, right? Rouge, rose, and red are all different colors. So it's good to have those shades of meaning. So we lose some of the shades of meaning when we're doing a dub. The other thing, and this is, this is totally subjective, not totally subjective, but mostly subjective. A lot of times the quality of the dub, that is the acting in the dub, is not up to a standard that I would consider good. And this is really true of some of the really older dubs. Like if you watched anime in the 90s, if you were like me and you grew up trying to get anime from Japan, a lot of times you just didn't have an option to get a subtitle version at all. You got an English dubbed version because that's what they sold on VHS, and there was no separate audio tracks or anything back then. So you watched really bad dubs, and you just got kind of used to the fact that the language and the acting was really, really poor. So that's another reason I prefer that, is that it just eliminates that problem. And the last one is that when you're listening to the Japanese audio, you get a level of communication of what the actors in their performance, even if you don't speak Japanese or you have very minimal speaking of Japanese, there's still a lot of emotional content to that delivery. The choice of vocal tone, where the pitch is a bigger thing. I feel like people notice it more, or I certainly notice it more when it's in a Japanese program versus an American program. What pitch level they choose to have a character speak at has all the characters speak at very profoundly different pitch levels, which communicate things. But that emotional content is closer to what the director of the program actually wanted. So that contains an element of the artistic direction, which gets lost when you have it to a dub, or potentially gets lost when you go to a dub. So that's another reason too. And when I say all this, I'm not saying that all English dubs are bad, or you're bad if you like to watch English dubs. I'm just saying that they're less accurate in general, and in some cases they are less accurate in very significant ways because they attempt to make the language idiomatic, and that's all I'm really saying. So I prefer to get as close to the source as possible whenever I'm watching anything that's foreign. So I prefer subtitles for everything, whether it's from Japan or some other country, because the subtitles tend to be the most accurate. Now, of course, you are relying on the accuracy of the subtitles translation to also not contain those idiomatic elements. But I have noticed, and you can do this like what I just said, English language subtitles, you'll notice that the subtitles don't contain that same approach to using localized language and things like that. So anyway, that's my opinion on that. Leave me your opinion down below. Do you like subs versus dubs? What's your feeling on it? And give me your reasoning. So I'd like to hear some other opinions too. And I will see you guys next time.